Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Fire in Landscape Management, Strategies for Living with It. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. And by collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with the organizations, they're the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, the Illinois Landscape Contractors Association Sustainability Committee, the Kansas City Native Plant Initiative, and Rescape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Alan Long. Dr. Long is Professor Emeritus with the School of Forest Resources and Conservation at the University of Florida. He retired from the university to serve as Administrative Director of Southern Fire Exchange, a regional science delivery consortium. Dr. Long has taught and researched fire ecology, forest operations, and private forest management, and spent 10 years focusing both research and outreach on fire hazard assessment and issues. He served as the Florida statewide coordinator for forestry extension and conducted dozens of landowner workshops. Dr. Long has authored many publications and reports, has received numerous awards for his extensive work in forestry and fire ecology. Welcome, Alan.
Well, thank you, Penny, and thank you to all of you who have joined us. I hope that today's webinar will answer some questions that you may have, hopefully provide some new insights and information for you. I think before I jump too far into this, I would like to just let you know what the take-home points are so that as we go through this, you'll be able to kind of filter things that we're talking about through these 3 or 4 major points. And then maybe that will help frame some questions for you. I was going to mention just by introduction that the wildfires that we have seen and heard about, and maybe that's over the last couple of years, especially in California, and maybe that's a reason you're on this webinar today, is that those are not new, and whatever we might hear about global climate change and other things, that there have been those kinds of fires that have gone on throughout our history. Many cases of these very severe wildfires moving through towns and other places. And so living with fire is not something that's new. It certainly takes on a whole new context, if you will, living today because of the numbers of people that have moved out into those wildland areas where fire occurs. So the take-home points. First one is that living with fire is all about reducing wildfire risk, and we're going to focus a little bit initially on just kind of a primer about wildland fire, hoping that maybe it adds a little bit of new information for some of you. We'll kind of look at that in terms of what it means for home ignitions, and then given that sort of background on fire and home ignitions, what can you do in the landscape and landscape design? And I'm assuming that many of you are involved somehow in landscape design or planning or community planning. That this will all fit. But second take-home point is how can you do that in a way that's compatible with risk reduction? Third point is using fire to reduce wildfire. I think everyone's heard that phrase, fighting fire with fire, and that's what prescribed fire is. It is one of the many tools in the toolbox to help reduce risk through the vegetation that's surrounding homes and communities. And we'll spend a little time talking about kind of a primer on prescribed fire and why it is so valuable and effective as a tool in landscape management. Fourth point, just with 2 slides at the end, is that you have many resources to help you if you do have a lot of other questions and things and people you want to talk to about this. So let's dive in with a little bit of an introduction just to fire itself. What's it all about? And in teaching about fire, there's 2 basic triangles that are used. One, the combustion triangle, that shows that fuel, oxygen, and heat are all essentials for fire to occur. And if you want to stop that ignition, stop that combustion process. You just have to remove one of those three things. And all fire suppression efforts, whether it's local city fire departments or wildland firefighters, are all trying to do one of those three things. The other side of that, and that's for any fire, including the fire on your stove, if that ever happens. The other triangle is one about trying to understand how fire actually occurs in the environment and where and why it does what it does. Weather, fuel, and topography, the three critical elements to how fire behaves. So, for example, on the topography side, we know that as slopes get steeper, fire will preheat the fuels. Radiant heat will preheat the fuels going up the slope, and fires will move much faster upslope than they would if it was on level ground. Similarly, as winds increase, and you all know this, that fire spread also increases. But interestingly, as we talk about those two parts of the fire behavior triangle, the real one that we can do something about is the fuel side of it. And that's what most of today, this webinar is going to be about. But there is one other issue when we talk about winds and wind speeds, and think back about the two fires, well, not two, but the 2 years of really bad fires in California, especially the Paradise and the Napa complex of fires the year before. That much of the spread of those fires was due to embers, burning pieces of grass, burning pieces of rooftop, burning leaves off of trees, anything that might still be burning and blowing in the wind have the potential to move the fire much faster and much farther than just the wind blowing the flame itself. And those embers play a critical role in the sort of things that we're going to be talking about. Let me switch gears real quickly and just talk about fire itself in the environment. It is a natural process in almost all of North American systems. There's a few places where you won't find fire, except maybe on very, very rare occasions, but it is a natural process that occurs, and it is a significant ecological process, as we'll see in a couple of the following slides. And it will happen. Naturally, it occurs almost all with lightning, but as we learned over the last year, volcanoes in Hawaii will do that same thing. So there are some other natural causes, but 99% is probably all going to be due to lightning. But on the human side, it's a whole different story, where you can have human ignited fires purposely, accidentally, under a whole variety of different kinds and conditions. And that fellow on the left is purposely lighting that, but it is a prescribed fire. A bit exciting right at the beginning there. The one on the bottom right was also a prescribed fire that had been started and was burning through in the afternoon. So why I'm going to say this is a natural process, and it has a very important ecological role there. From a fire ecology standpoint, we look at ecosystems in terms of how frequent fires occur in those and what are the impacts and what kinds of fires are they. And probably the most common in many ecosystems is what we call the frequent light fires, where only occur every couple of years, usually grass or some similar plants to grasses, low shrubs, or perennial kinds of plants are the main fuels on the forest floor. But in those systems, in grasslands and the longleaf pine kinds of systems, very frequent fire moving through those are usually light in terms of their intensity. They're not fires that cause big problems unless there's a big wind. And the Paradise Fire, for example, certainly the Napa Valley fires, largely burned through a lot of grass, but they were burning on those very, very high wind speeds that occurred in those wind events. Looking at the bottom picture, eastern hardwoods very seldom have fires in those, anywhere from 25 to 100 or 200 years. Very infrequent, but they do happen. And 3 years ago, such a fire burned through Gatlinburg, Tennessee. It happened to be at the end of a long drought. It was the end of the dry season. And in fact, rain occurred on it in the middle of the night after it burned its way through Gatlinburg. But once again, that was it occurred because of a very high wind event that happened over about a 12-hour period. Systems that we hear about more often with fire are the chaparral systems of California, like on the upper right, or the scrub communities in Florida on the middle. Both of those kinds of systems, and they occur throughout the west and the southwest and the southeast, are systems that fires do not occur in very often, but the shrubs in those systems grow back very rapidly and are back to flammable conditions very, very quickly. And they are severe fires. Brush burns very intensely. Some of the other pine systems like jack pine, lodgepole, and the lake states occur with crown fires, very intense fires, but not very frequently. And that was the sort of fire that burned through the Yosemite back in 1987 that got all the news about destroying our national heritage, but it was just a natural process of converting those systems back to new stands of that lodgepole pine. The challenge in any of these systems when we're thinking about fire and people is the residential development that has occurred within those communities, where they may be up against wildland systems or they may be embedded in those. And kind of clockwise from the top left is a community near Bend in Central Oregon. On the right, a community with much more widely spread out houses in pine hardwoods in Georgia. And then the two bottom ones are in Florida, with a home kind of embedded in one of those shrub pine systems, and a community that's up against those systems. And that bottom left is again a prescribed fire. We'll see that picture again and talk about it a little later. So in all these communities, when there is that sort of development, fire suppression efforts make a major effort at controlling those fires much more aggressively than they would if there were no homes and developments in those. And under that kind of aggressive control, when they can do it, it keeps fire out of the system. And when fire is absent from almost any of our North American ecosystems, and especially if there's shrubs in those, they transition to mixed shrub and tree communities, or more dense shrubs if it's out in an open land. It increases the vertical growth and the vertical development, and vertical vegetation means vertical fuels for fires, which leads to more intense fires than if you had just grass on that surface. There's other ecological things that happen as diversity, spatial diversity, and mosaics decrease, but all of that leads to more intense fires and structural damage if there's homes nearby. And that's going to be our transition then to talk a little bit about how does structural ignition occur, because that's what we're trying to reduce the risk of things happening. The picture on the left is the Oakland Hills a year after the fire in 1991 that burned over 3,000 homes in a little less than 15 hours and took 25 lives. And it was a mass event that occurred because, once again, of a very high wind event that occurred that day. But it illustrates the fact that heat is transferred by radiation from one house to another that cause it, convection where heat rises and goes up the hill, brings heat up underneath other houses, and conduction where direct flame contact or things are in contact. The actual ignition of structures isn't quite so simple as those heat transfer methods, but most of the structural ignition occurs with firebrands that either land on surfaces like the wood roof or wood decks or porches, or in the fine fuels right adjacent to houses like pine needles or wood mulches or something like that. It may occur by direct flame contact, but ahead of that direct flame contact, there's radiant heat and convection that may be melting things like vinyl surfaces and embedding embers on wood. And radiant heat can also break windows. All three of those things happen when an adjacent structure ignites. It produces radiant heat, produces embers, it produces direct flame contact. And when homes are like those in the Oakland Hills, where they're just one right beside the other, you get into a case of structural ignition, one structure igniting another through all three of these ignition mechanisms. Let's ask more specifically which of those mechanisms are most available through different landscaping features. And so, for example, the checks under firebrands indicate that shrubs, vines, small trees, and to some extent large trees, if they ignite, are sources of firebrands to ignite either home structures or other vegetation around the structures. Direct flame contact will can come from each of those except large trees, because the fuel in large trees is high up above it and can rain down embers if it catches fire, which it seldom does. And then radiant heat comes mainly from shrubs and small trees and fences that are adjacent to a home structure also. So out of both of those, all of those things, it's shrubs and the small trees are by far the most important structural features in terms of landscape contributions to ignitions. Your goal, and my admittedly relatively limited scope compared to all of you who are involved in landscape and planning or management in some ways, but your goal is to consider these kinds of basic fire principles in your landscape planning so that when a home like on top is totally surrounded by fire, it still is survivable. Or a second part of that goal I have for you anyway is to promote prescribed fire where it will work for you. And if you're located in places where prescribed burning is not done very often, then that may not be one of the tools in the toolbox. But if you're in some other states, as we'll see in a minute, that may be a very valuable tool for you. So as we look into this whole topic then of reducing structural risk and risk, wildland fire risk in communities, the first step that's very, very important is to do risk assessment. And there's a definition there in terms of evaluating the likelihood that a home or a community will experience wildfire, which is kind of one step of it, but the underlying "and" is perhaps more important, because part of that risk assessment is that community going to be vulnerable to it then? Is that home going to be vulnerable to a wildland fire occurring nearby? And the components of those risk assessments are listed here. The first three, vegetation or fuels, the vulnerability of the home itself, the way it's designed and constructed, exterior-wise at least. And then the likelihood of ignition, the likelihood of a wildland fire occurring, are those three things especially deal with individual homes and structures. The last three components are more relevant for a community if you're looking at how the community is developed, whether there's access for water, for fire control trucks and vehicles to get in there and to do work. And then at a statewide or a community level, the resource and asset values, what all is in that area as they're trying to decide what the risk potential is. And these risk assessments are done on a number of different scales. California is sort of the largest scale that, or it had been anyway, up until recently, where the state looks at vegetation, topography, resource values, and then some fire history to try and define what are the highest fire hazard zones, what are moderate fire hazard zones, and develop that into a map, a GIS system these days, and use that kind of a mapping assessment system for defining ordinances and laws for those areas, for looking at standards that might be applicable for building and for community development. And a new feature that they added was that homes in the high hazard zones had to disclose the hazard of where they were when they were planning to sell their homes. Texas followed suit. A number of other states followed suit from California. Texas was one of those states, and they turned their risk assessment then into a much larger one across the 13 states in the southern region through the guidance of the Southern Group of State Foresters. And that is all online now as the Southern Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal. I listed the URL there for it, although you could just Google Southern Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal if you're in any of those states. All the colors are there. There's two portals to go into that. One is for a general portal for homeowners or other people just interested, and they can kind of burrow down into that county in Mississippi and their part of the county and see whether that's considered a high wildfire risk area or not. It doesn't tell them necessarily what the risk is for their own home. We'll talk about that in a second. But it does identify communities that may be at risk because of fire hazards. And then that serves as a great planning resource for the professionals who come in through the professional portal and can really burrow into all the data and look at what it means for them for developing plans for fire protection, mitigation, and so on. Again, that's kind of at the state level and at larger community or county levels. Down at the individual communities, there's a whole other set of assessments that can be done. The oldest are those that were tied to the FireWise Communities program, and that white sheet in the middle is the most recent, just updated version of the FireWise program if you want to Google that and pull it up and look at it. FireWise communities were largely built on the NFPA 1144 standards, which do risk assessments based on the 4 major things that are listed there. And there's other methodologies that are out there for looking at fire hazard assessment across sort of community or small regional level. There's also individual property risk assessments, and these are important especially because if a landowner for any of that home in the picture or other pictures wants to know what their actual vulnerability is, they need an individual assessment like that they're probably not going to get out of any of those community or statewide assessments. And so there's a number of different versions of these that are available. Most of them focus on looking at vegetation or fuels that surround the home, and the other is the home design and the construction materials that are used for it. The Living with Fire was developed initially as a kind of a big pamphlet out of the University of Nevada at Reno. It was copied by a lot of other states and agencies. We developed a couple in the South specifically for Florida. The one on the left, Landscaping in Florida, with fire in mind, is focused on the landscaping around a home to look at kind of rapidly whether there's a risk problem there. And then the more complex Wildfire Risk Assessment Guide is regional across the 13 southern states, looking at both vegetation and the home structure and assessing the risk and ways to mitigate that risk. All right, so that's risk assessment. Let's talk about landscaping strategies themselves and some of the issues tied to those. I've listed 5 issues. There's more, I'm sure, there. But all of these strategies are based on a lot of different studies that have been done, mostly after the fact, after a fire, of asking the question, why, for a picture like that, when some homes burned, when the wildland on the left and over on the far right all burned, why were their homes still standing in the middle that did not? Was it defensible space? Was it the shrubs that weren't there? Mulches, access, maintenance? What was it that made some homes survive and others not? And most of these strategies about landscaping and FireWise landscaping have been based on studies of communities like that have gone through those fires. So the most important question leading off that list is what is defensible space? There's 2 parts to the defining it. One is it's the area and the vegetation around a structure that improves the likelihood that it will survive if there is a wildfire and nobody's home. What if the fire resources can't get there? What if Joe Public standing in his driveway there thinks he's going to fight it off with a hose? Will it survive in their absence if they weren't there? And that house demonstrates a number of principles for that we'll look at in a minute, but there is room there that it could be protected from those large shrubs on the left. There's a few other features that may or may not be helpful in terms of defensible space, but that's part of the definition. The whole purpose of that defensible space is to prevent structural ignition. The other half of that definition on it is that it's also the space around a structure for the firefighting crews, if they can get there, to be able to operate safely. And so, for example, there's plenty of that sort of space around the home at the right. It was protected from fire all around it. There are a lot of greenery, a lot of vegetation, a lot of landscaping that was done there, but there was room for firefighting forces to operate. The structure on the left doesn't have anywhere near that 30 feet of space for fire suppression activities. That's just a combustion waiting to happen. Defensible space is not a total clearing of vegetation. I got a kick out of taking that picture of that house up on top, which, although it looks green, that's just weeds coming up. Most of that hillside is all rock covered. Great barrier to a wildland fire, although they did leave a couple of big standing coniferous trees really close to the house, but it is not total clearing of vegetation. And as I read in a quote back in the early 2000s, it is not a ravage to the landscape architecture profession, at least not from my pretty limited landscape architecture perspective. That home is one that had been totally surrounded by trees and shrubs and brush and some real problems in terms of potential fire on the bottom, but it has been through a landscape renovation to make it more defensible in terms of defensible space. Most defensible space, people look at it and advocate for it, talk about different zones for it. One zone within at least 5 feet of the home that may be broad, wider if you're on a steep hillside is where you prevent ember or firebrand ignition of the structure, landing in a mulch that's flammable right next to wood siding. It's what you want to do to keep ignition from some sort of ember or something igniting the structure itself. If it's all concrete block, then it's got a lot more protection, but for homes that have vinyl or wood siding, that particular zone is of very great importance. Then for the next 5 to 30 feet or 50 feet, your goal is to reduce the radiant heat load that would be there if it was all shrubs or junipers all side by side, and to prevent direct flame contact. By clearing vegetation and opening it up in that zone, it helps to reduce the rate of spread coming into it. Although if it's high winds and blowing embers, it won't slow that down. And zone 3 is further out from that. This says 50 to 100 feet. A lot of people say 100 feet is sufficient for that. 150 feet is probably more applicable, especially if you're on slopes for the clearing below the structure on the slope. All of those clearing and opening up of the vegetation are designed to reduce firebrands and to slow the rate of spread. Within those zones, then, as people are looking at vegetation, they often ask a question about, well, what about plant flammability? Can we buy plants that aren't going to burn? If there's any of you in California, there is something called ice plant out there. I grew up in California. That's where I started fighting fires in 1963. The ice plant was pretty non-flammable, but I do understand that in one of those fires a couple of years ago, it evidently even burned too. So all species will burn. Some of them far more problematic than others, and I've given a list there of those kinds of features that contribute to flammability of things like lots of small, thin leaves, densely compact. Conifer needles are always, especially if they're draped down, if they've fallen out of pine trees and they're draped down in the vegetation. Surface area to volume ratio is a really important one. That's very typical of that sawpaw meadow in the top picture, which is ubiquitous across Florida, and also very flammable. And when it burns, embers include whole fronds to little tiny pieces of it. It will send all sorts of stuff blowing in the wind. And actually, if you take all these features together, by far the real monster out there in terms of plant flammability and problem are shrubs, especially when they're planted close together and they have those kinds of features. So they're not bad out in the landscape where you're away from structures. That bottom picture was a very hot bed of those sawpaw meadows during the 1998 fires here in Florida, but that's not what you want next to your house. There's a couple other important principles tied to plant flammability. People say, well, let's use mulches. We can prevent fire that way, but in fact, mulches also burn. The most ignitable are pine needles. Shredded bark and wood will burn, and less ignitable are large bark and gravel, absolutely not flammable. Some key principles for defensible space. There is horizontal separation. These are based on before and after pictures in Florida. I apologize for the limit there, but horizontal separation where you clear out the vegetation enough to open it up and allow that flammable vegetation not to be nearby. But there's a lot of different options for ways and patterns to do that. And also you need to look at vertical separation. Those are what we call fuel ladders, with the shrubs low and then shrubs higher and vines down into those. And so part of the process of separating vertically is to open it up, remove all that middle layer of vegetation, and create more of the landscape on the bottom. And as you can see, in both of those, it's paramount to reduce shrub density from what's on the top picture down on the bottom picture. Those were the same house in the background on those. And again, I listed palmetto and gallberry as examples here, chaparral on the west, and you all probably have similar shrub species wherever you are that can be very problematic. Another important principle on defensible space is that it's got to be maintained, because all that stuff grows back. It collects and falls on rooftops, on decks and porches, and so an annual program of maintenance is critical for moving, keeping those fuels out and away from homes from one year to the next. Here's a list of kind of summarizing the defensible space and those other 4 issues that I mentioned. But removing ladder fuels, thinning trees, removing plants that certainly with flammable or dead fuels within 30 feet of the house, and thinning shrubs further out. Keeping shrubs down to a low state if you have them in islands and various places. Large trees are great for shade. Maintain those. Those are certainly a good part of the landscape. And then dispose of dead materials and slash as you pick it up. Favor low flammability vegetation. So even though everything does burn when it's very, very dry, there are things that burn more or less. And you'll find that most state agencies or cooperative extension services have produced lists of more or less flammable vegetation in your areas. Keep trees away from power lines. In high winds, that's often creating sparks to produce the embers that lead to wildfires. Driveways and paths are good breaks in that. Mulches like pine needles away from the house are good for soil protection. And then store combustible things like wood piles under decks on the house are not a good idea. And then kind of the last one on this is promoting vegetation reduction in undeveloped lots. A lot of communities, until they're built out, end up with lots that are overgrown next to houses. And some sort of vegetation reduction on those will take away those embers that are close to already built homes. I've already talked about maintaining fireproof conditions. Let me go on from that and talk about these options that you have for maintaining that vegetation on the next door lot or in your own backyard or other places. A lot of different methods to do it. The choice for doing those is based on the criteria on the right. I'm only going to talk about the prescribed burning because that's kind of our focus. But if you do prescribe burning for it, when that second criterion, need for retreatment, it has to be redone again and again. And so that's the same thing with grazing animals or mechanical systems. So that's certainly an important part for consideration. So prescribed fire. In the minutes we have, the time that we have left, I'd like to spend a little bit on prescribed fire and why it is such a favorite tool in a lot of places. Wildfires are unplanned. There's no control over the smoke or the burning conditions. That's why they're wildfires. And the damage can be highly variable. The top picture was a great big wide open ecosystem that didn't have structures in it. It's a whole different story if you're up in the mountains in the eastern U.S. or somewhere else and that fire gets into one of those wooden structures and spreads from one to the other. With prescribed fires, they're conducted under acceptable conditions. You can manage where the smoke goes. There's that picture again of a prescribed fire next to a community, and the damage can be minimized, both in terms of anything that might be structural, but even in the communities that you're looking at, the vegetation communities. So this definition of prescribed burning was written into the Florida statutes back in about 1990. And it was the basis for the prescribed burning law in Florida, which has become a model sort of for many other states who have been picking up and doing more prescribed burning. The key terms in it is those in italics: applying fire to vegetative fuels, not to houses, under a written prescription, under specified conditions. Those are the weather conditions and the fuel conditions, with precautionary measures that meet management objectives, and especially important, that keeps it confined to the planned fire area. This survey was done completed last year, and written up last year, completed the year before, but looking at the amount of prescribed burning done across the country, the darkest colors being the most burning, the 4 states identified there between Kansas, Oklahoma, Florida, and Georgia, all do burning over 1 million acres a year. But a lot of the other states do prescribe burning too. Some for wildland purposes, some for especially in the Midwest for grazing and cattle production. Some of the major objectives that go into that prescribed burning are things like wildfire hazard reduction, the main one that we're talking about here, but that's for controlling vegetation, and it also will improve regeneration, as we'll see in a minute. It improves forage crops underneath it. It's good for site preparation if you're doing some site restoration. It only controls vegetation, though, for a short time. It's also a major tool for restoring or maintaining ecosystems, especially those that have endangered plants and animals in them. That's a gopher tortoise on the bottom, a highly fire-dependent critter down here in Florida. There's also objectives in prescribed burning for animals. Fire in general improves wildlife habitat, increases forage, increases things like berries and seed production over a period of time, and it oftentimes favors nesting and foraging sites for different animals. Livestock production is especially important because of its effect on forage quantity and palatability. And in all of these things, it does recycle nutrients. Some go up in smoke. A lot more of them go down into the soil. In any prescribed burning, there are requirements. Most of these are written in statutes where where the state laws apply to it. There are still a few folks out there probably that just apply matches in their backyard without thinking through these things. But if you're going to do prescribed burning, you need to meet these requirements. And one of them is having a written fire plan that we'll look at in a second. The other is that you know what the weather forecast is, and you've already planned your fire to fit that kind of forecast condition. You have an authorization or permit, and to keep it confined to that area, you have the equipment sufficient to keep it that way and to control escapes. Planning steps for a prescribed fire include determining what those objectives are going to be, why you want to do that burning, not just for no good reason. You want to look at the unit, recon it, figure out what's out there, know what the fuels are, what the conditions are, what the slopes are, what are you going to need in terms of people to do that job, and then write a prescription for that. We'll look at it in just a second. Usually those prescriptions include, if they're larger burns, supplemental plans that cover the safety of the crew and the people and anyone that might have structures nearby. Things like holding actions, how are we going to keep it in that confined area? What do we do afterwards to make sure there aren't smoke issues? And also the contingencies, just in case it does get away. The reconnaissance includes all these things that are listed here. I listed infrastructure, meaning in special concern features, things that are important on it. That forest on the right is burned annually with prescribed fire, but way back on the far side of it, just out of sight, is a major university conference center. And that that means any prescribed burning that stand has to take that into utmost planning. Includes a map and a photo, and the prescription may be a simple one page like this if you're talking about a small burn area of, a couple of acres to maybe a couple hundred acres. It includes all the things listed down on the left, all the things that are basically your document that when you get a prescription, you're saying, here's what I'm doing, here's how I'm going to burn it, here's what's all been thought out, so that you've got that background and that written record of what your planning was for doing the prescribed burn. And a map in capital letters, you always have to have the map to show where it is and what your weather conditions and planned weather conditions were. The smoke management part of it is the evaluating. If you know you want to burn an area and you think about what the weather conditions might be for that, and if you look at those weather conditions and you know where the smoke will go under those weather conditions, and you want to make sure that that's going to go in a place that's going to be acceptable. And that's what the smoke management evaluation and plan is all about, is making sure you've excuse me, thought through that process of where smoke will go as part of your fire. Your basic objectives are to keep it away from smoke-sensitive areas, things like airports, senior living facilities, highways, freeways, making sure that it's not going to go somewhere in the middle of the night and end up down on the flat plains where there's going to be a real heavy fog layer. And so if you realize that the smoke is going in that direction, then you have to go back to the prescription and change it and plan for different wind directions. And then as part of the actual burning, the way you ignite the fire and burn it is how you disperse and dilute the smoke before it could reach other smoke-sensitive areas that may be way downwind from it. And that ignition method and technique for lighting the fire will also have an impact on how much emissions are actually put out by that fire. And in fact, what you're trying to do, and most of that, is to get the smoke, like the two columns on the left, get it up and out into the atmosphere, versus the smoke columns on the right that are going to the right, blowing with the wind into everybody that's downwind from that. Okay, getting near the end here. Some of the tools of the trade. How is all that ignition actually done? Probably the most fundamental piece of it is the drip torch, or this burn pot, whatever you want to call it. It's a diesel fuel mix, and you ignite fire with it. Dripping it by hand, as the guy on the left, or I've got some good friends down here who do it off horseback. You might put it on the back of an ATV and light it off of that, cover a lot more ground that way. You can put it on a helicopter and cover a lot of ground with it. Or you can use with that helicopter, you can mount instead this gizmo that you see down in the lower left corner, which shoots out ping pong balls that are filled with a chemical that ignites upon landing on the ground. And so you can light out a whole string of little circular fires that burn into each other. All right, well, I'm down to the last couple of slides. If some of you have some questions that you've been thinking about and you want to go ahead and enter them in the question box, now would be a good time to do that. But the kind of this last point I want to address is, where does prescribed fire fit in landscape management? If you've been pondering this and trying to figure it out, that most important one, I think, is what we've been talking about through most of those. It's a way of reducing the vegetation, surrounding vegetation, without getting rid of it. It reduces it, but it all sprouts and grows back again and greens back up again. But it greatly reduces the number of embers from nearby land that might impact homes and structures. And as those lands green back up again, that burned area, a lot of homeowners really like that view shed now. Things are greened up. You can see wildlife back in there. If there have been piles that were created after some mechanical treatment around the community, that's a way to get rid of those piles. If you don't use some sort of a wood grinder, it can be used as part of fuel breaks around communities, where just strips or bands are created kind of out of sight of everybody, but it's a great big opening where fire cannot spread across from a adjacent wildland community into the developed community. And if you have a large enough lot, you might want to use it for cleaning up some wilder parts of individual properties. That is done, but you probably don't do that on less than an acre. But there are folks that will do that sort of thing. In fact, I lived in that house once, and I did that down in the backyard to control vines that were creeping all over the place, back down behind that. But, sort of in closing, the purpose in any of these things in terms of mitigating fire hazards have to match up with all the other landscaping objectives you have, whether it's to conserve energy and water, enjoy the natural surroundings and the aesthetics, promoting wildlife in the area. All of these options are possible, I think, if you try and include mitigating fire hazards into it. And I would conclude that in most cases, fire-wise landscaping can reduce fire risk, while also, I like the word optimizing. That may not be the very best word, but at least help you meet all of your other objectives also. Okay, well, I said I just mentioned some resources you can tap into. The NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, you can Google on their website, their 1144 standards deal with wildland urban interface and landscapes. The FireWise program was all developed to do that. The Fire Adapted Community Learning Network is a similar program. It's nationwide, as is FireWise programs, of people all working together to help create fire adapted communities, looking at all the different facets of a community and where wildfire is just part of that, and how do they work with that in order to be able to live with fire. I mentioned the risk assessment guide for homeowners, the living with fire guides that are out there, and most of those sort of things are available through state forestry agencies or county fire departments or your county cooperative extension service. And one last network to consider, the Fire Science Exchange Network, which I was involved with the Southern Fire Exchange for 9 years, but they are regionally across the whole country under the Joint Fire Science Program. They're dedicated to making sure that land managers and fire managers have the very best applicable science for doing what they do in land management. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about strategies for living with fire. If you've got some questions, we'll take those now. If you think of some afterwards or we don't get through them all, just feel free to send me an email and ask a question. Thank you very much.
All right, excellent. Thank you. We do have a few questions for you. The first one is, don't prescribed fires sometimes get out of control? And a corollary question, what sorts of preparations are done prior to a prescribed burn to mitigate that?
Okay, good question. Thank you. I can't tell you across the country what it is. I know in Florida, after 20 years where they've been tracking that less than 0.5%, which is about 1 out of 200 may escape and get away. But what's interesting, the only prescribed fires that you ever hear about, almost ever hear about, unless it's in your local area, are the ones that get away. So that's why people hear about that. But I suspect that across the country, it's fairly similar, that it's maybe at the outside 1 or 2% that get away. And usually what happens is, because all prescribed fires are mitigated before they're ever started. There's fire lines that are built around those. The boundaries of the units are laid out to match up with, say, creeks or roads. There's fire equipment that's on site, either with hoses or other equipment like that. But once in a while, something will happen. There'll be a wind shift. There'll be something that will drop down out of clouds in terms of some winds that blow in all directions. There's just once in a while some of those odd and end things where embers will blow over the line and get on the other side and not be seen before it has a chance to get away. There is probably a higher percent, another 3 or 4 or 5%, that embers will get out of those fires, but because of the contingency forces that are there, the backup fire crews, the handline people that are there, water resources, ATVs with tanks on them, whatever it is, there's a lot of embers that do get over on the other side of the line and will start burning, and they get put out right away. But it's that very, very small part of a percent of fires that actually escape.
Okay. The photo that you showed of one prescribed fire in Florida with the row of houses, it didn't look like there was any firefighting equipment between the burn and the houses. Were there firefighters there, but just in another location, not in the photo?
Yeah, they were probably not in the photo. That's one of many communities. One of the water management districts here has a lot of their state-owned lands, water management lands, that are embedded in the larger area with these firewise communities around them, which is what that picture was, but there's a lot of others like that too. And they burn those all the time, but they burn them. If you notice on that, the smoke was blowing away from the community. And so they only would burn those areas when the wind forecast was in the opposite direction like that and blowing away from it. And they did have a very wide fire line. I'm not sure just how clearly that was evident in the picture, but there was a real wide fire line just on the other side of the fence, actually on both sides of the fence, because that's the boundary line. And characteristically, people come out and bring their ATVs or their golf carts out and park along that fence line and watch them burn that because it's so interesting. But there were forces there. They handle that as a ground ignition with people along that fire line, and they probably, given where the smoke was and how it was moving away from it, I presume that the actual igniting forces were down the trail somewhere, carrying the fire line further down. But they have other ATVs. Typically, an operation like that would have an ATV or two or three patrolling up and down that fire line, and they probably just were not evident in that picture.
Okay. You mentioned that conifer forests are much more susceptible to wildfires, but that mixed deciduous conifer forests are at threat. So we had a couple of questions that came in about deciduous forests in the east and how they often have a foot or more of leaves and brush on the forest floor, and just what is the threat of wildfires in those communities?
Yeah, in the hardwood forests, especially the deciduous ones, and any of you who are living in those, you know that most of summer you get thunderstorms of one sort or another in fronts, and so those forests are usually pretty wet during the summer, and not very flammable, and certainly everything underneath is fairly damp. But in the fall, either as leaves are falling or once that's all done, it also gets into a real dry season. And sometimes there's a dry season in the spring, but the fall dry season is the more problematic one. And you've got new dried leaves falling on the ground. You've also go into that period in September, October, maybe in November, depending where in the east you are, that it's just dried down a lot. There hasn't been much in the way, once the hurricane season is over, there hasn't been much more in the rain for a couple of months. And that's the fire season in those systems. And usually those fires stay on the ground in that dry foliage. If there's real dense shrubs like the azaleas and others in the Smoky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, fire may burn up into that brush, but it doesn't usually go very far. Unfortunately, that was not what happened in Gatlinburg, because it had been a long dry, very dry, and there was a very high wind event that came in late one morning, and took a little small fire that was burning and blew it down a hill and into Gatlinburg. And so those kinds of systems do have times when, under the very worst of weather conditions, that they can burn. And there have been other cases like that in hardwood forests. If you go back a couple hundred years, there were big fires in Maine and Michigan and Minnesota that burned through big, vast communities, vegetation communities in smaller towns, because of very dry and windy events. The conifer forests tend to be more out west, where summers are dry, and that's why they tend to be more flammable. Pine needles do a great job of carrying fire. That's what's mainly carrying the fire in the picture in front of us right now.
All right. Can wildfires burn in a swamp or in wetlands?
When they dry out, yeah. Yes, there have been a number of examples in the South over the last 20 years. And of course, I would go way back before that too. But swamps also ebb and flow, and at least the shallower parts of swamps will dry out in prolonged droughts. The Okefenokee Swamp in South Georgia over the last 10 years has had several of those drought events that led to fires in the swamp themselves. Now, if there's water in it, it doesn't burn through that part of it. But wherever it has dried out and the fire has been able to smolder down into muck, the swamps will burn.
So thank you, Alan, and we appreciate all of this great information.
Good. Thank you, Penny.